Imagine this. An ordinary family, just sitting down to enjoy a meal together. But things take a sudden turn when two cops walk in, targeting them for no reason other than the color of their skin. They didn't expect the father to be a decorated Army Commandant. They didn't expect him to stand his ground. But what happens next will leave you speechless. Before we dive into this shocking story, let me know in the comments where in the world are you watching from. And if you want to see more stories like this, don't forget to like this, don't forget to comment and subscribe. It was a bright Saturday afternoon when the Carter family, looking forward to a quiet lunch together, entered the Copper Grill, a bustling restaurant in the heart of the city. The atmosphere was warm, with the clink of glasses and the hum of conversation filling the air. The family of four, Jamal, his wife Patrice, their teenage son Malik, and their younger daughter Amara, had been eagerly anticipating this meal. Jamal had just returned from a training exercise, and it had been weeks since they had all sat down together for a proper meal. The restaurant was lively, full of chatter and laughter. As they approached the hostess, Jamal smiled and greeted her. But there was a slight hesitation in her eyes as she looked at the family. She quickly led them to a table near the back, away from the windows, almost as if it were a quieter corner. Patrice noticed the strange behavior immediately but said nothing. She didn't want to make a scene. Malik, always observant, raised an eyebrow. "Did you see that, Dad?" he whispered. She didn't even smile. Jamal glanced up and caught a glimpse of the hostess's hurried retreat. It didn't feel right. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Let's just eat, Malik. It's probably nothing." They settled into their seats, with Amara chattering excitedly about her school week. Jamal smiled at his daughter, but his mind was elsewhere. It wasn't like him to ignore small signs. He'd spent years in the military, trained to notice details, to read people's behavior. Something about this restaurant wasn't sitting well with him, but he didn't want to cause trouble, at least, not until he had a clear reason. As the waiter came over, his face was polite, but his gaze avoided Jamal's. He rattled off the specials and handed them menus without making eye contact. "I'll give you a moment," he said before retreating quickly. Patrice, still smiling, tried to shake off the feeling of unease. "Maybe he's just having a rough day," she whispered, though she didn't quite believe it herself. It was then that two uniformed police officers walked in. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded an air of authority that made the room go quiet for a moment. One of them, Officer Johnson, glanced around the restaurant, his eyes briefly scanning the patrons before his gaze locked onto the Carter family. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He knew that look. It wasn't the casual, friendly glance of a cop who was just doing his job. It was something deeper, something rooted in judgment. The officer seemed to linger for a moment too long, his eyes narrowing when he noticed Jamal's military jacket. Patrice tensed, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "I don't like this," she whispered, clutching her purse tightly. "Stay calm," Jamal whispered back. His hand subtly rested on the table, ready to act, though he wasn't sure what action that would be. The officers, ignoring the other patrons, made their way over to the Carter family's table. Officer Johnson was the first to speak. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his tone cold, as he addressed Jamal. "We've had complaints about some unusual behavior in this area. We need to check your ID." Jamal's expression hardened, his military training kicking in. His gaze didn't leave the officer's face. "I'm just here with my family. I don't know what complaints you're talking about." Officer Johnson didn't flinch. "I said, we need to check your ID." Patrice's face turned red. She was about to speak up when Jamal placed a calm hand on her arm. "I'm not giving you my ID. I haven't done anything wrong." "Then you'll need to step outside with us," the officer insisted, his voice louder now. "We have a few questions to ask." The restaurant fell into an uncomfortable silence, as everyone's attention shifted to the confrontation. Malik's eyes widened, and he quickly stood up. "Dad, what's going on?" Jamal stood up, his military posture as straight as ever, though his blood was boiling. "We're not going anywhere," he said firmly, keeping his voice calm but strong. "You have no reason to ask us for anything." The second officer, Officer Roberts, who had been silent up until this point, finally spoke up, his voice low but menacing. "You think you can talk back to us? You really want to make this difficult?" Jamal's muscles tensed. This was not just about ID anymore. This was escalating fast. He glanced at Patrice, who looked ready to stand her ground, and then at Malik, who was looking at him wide-eyed. His heart tight. He had been through too much to be intimidated, but he had to think about his family. He couldn't let them get caught in this mess, not when there was no reason for it. "We're not going anywhere," Jamal repeated, his voice even. "I want your badge number, and if you're going to keep harassing my family, we'll be filing a report with your supervisor." For a moment, there was a tense pause. The officers exchanged a brief glance, unsure of how to proceed. The tension in the air was thick, and it felt like the restaurant was holding its breath. But that's when the unexpected happened. Just as the officers seemed to be deciding their next move, the door of the restaurant swung open with a loud creak. The dim, rainy light from the outside illuminated the room, and in stepped a tall, commanding figure, his presence instantly palpable. Dressed in a well-fitted suit, with a purposeful stride, the man exuded authority. Jamal felt a surge of relief rush through him, and for a split second, he hoped this stranger was just some well-meaning patron. But as the man's eyes scanned the room, his gaze locked onto the officers at the Carter family's table. A flash of recognition flickered in Jamal's mind. He knew that walk, he knew that bearing. The man was not just any stranger, he was someone with power, someone who didn't need to introduce himself to make his presence known. The officers, however, seemed oblivious. Officer Johnson sneered at Jamal one last time before stepping back. "Look, if you're not going to cooperate, then I'll handle this." The tall man's voice boomed across the room, cutting Officer Johnson off. His voice was calm but carried an undeniable weight. "You'll take your hands off this man and his family right now." The officers froze. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension in the air palpable as the man moved forward with unhurried steps. The sound of his polished shoes clicking against the floor filled the space. "Who do you think you are?" Officer Johnson finally muttered, his confidence slipping for the first time. "We don't need anyone's help here. This is a matter of protocol." The tall man didn't flinch. "Protocol?" He looked down at the officers with a disdainful gaze that made their towering forms seem insignificant. "Your protocol is harassment, and you know it." The air shifted. The subtle authority in the man's tone was enough to stop anyone in their tracks. Even the restaurant had grown quieter as eyes turned to see what would happen next. Jamal's heart raced, a sense of both relief and caution washing over him. This wasn't just any random person stepping in, this was someone with experience, with power, and he was here for a reason. The man stopped in front of Jamal, who had been standing his ground, his back straight, his gaze unwavering. He extended his hand toward him, and Jamal instinctively shook it. "Jamal Carter," the man said, his voice softer now but still firm. "Army Commandant. You served in Desert Storm, didn't you?" Jamal's eyes widened. This man knew him, knew who he was. He nodded slowly. "Yes, that's me. But how? Not important." The man cut him off. "What's important is that these officers understand that you're not just anyone. You're a decorated war hero, and I've been watching." The room fell into an even deeper silence as the officers stood frozen. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They had been so focused on intimidating Jamal and his family, so certain that they could control the situation, that they hadn't even thought to consider that Jamal's military background might be more than a coincidence. "Excuse me," Officer Roberts blurted out, attempting to regain some of his composure. "What's this all about?" "We're just trying to do our jobs." "Your jobs?" the Army Commandant replied, his eyes narrowing. "Your job is not to harass civilians based on your preconceived notion, and certainly not to treat a war veteran like this." Jamal didn't need to hear more. His chest swelled with pride, a mix of anger and empowerment filling him. He had fought for this country. He had put his life on the line. And now, these officers were threatening to undermine his dignity in front of his family. He stepped forward, looking directly at Officer Johnson. "You don't know what it's like, serving in a war. The things I've seen, and then to come home to be treated like this. This isn't right, and I'm not just going to stand here and take it." The officers remained silent, their faces flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. Officer Johnson seemed unsure of how to respond. He glanced at his partner, Officer Roberts, who shifted uneasily under the intense scrutiny of the Army Commandant. The Commandant took a step back, his voice now calm but filled with authority. "I suggest you two step back and leave this family alone. You've got no business here, and if I were you I'd start walking before this gets any worse." Patrice, who had been silently watching the exchange, felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. It was as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulder. The tension in the room was finally starting to fade, though she couldn't help but wonder if the confrontation had truly ended. She exchanged a brief glance with Malik, who was still wide-eyed at the sudden turn of events. "Dad," Malik whispered, his voice barely audible. "Who was that guy?" Jamal gave him a quick, reassuring smile, his hand briefly resting on his son's shoulder. "That's someone who understands what it means to stand up for the right thing." Patrice's eyes locked on the Army Commandant as he turned to face the officers one final time. He nodded, almost as if he were giving them a final warning. Without saying another word, he turned on his heel and made his way toward the door, the atmosphere in the restaurant slowly returning to normal. But the officers didn't move. Officer Roberts stood frozen, his hand hovering near his belt, while Officer Johnson's face remained red with anger. Neither of them had expected this kind of resistance. They had underestimated Jamal, and they had certainly underestimated who was watching. As the Army Commandant exited the restaurant, the weight of the moment seemed to hang in the air. The officers remained rooted to the spot, clearly shaken by the turn of events. The restaurant was still quiet, save for the distant chatter of patrons who had quietly resumed their meals, eyes occasionally darting toward the scene that had unfolded. Jamal, his family now visibly more at ease, took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension that had built up inside him. It wasn't just about standing his ground, it was about ensuring that his children didn't grow up believing that this kind of injustice was acceptable. "Is it over, Dad?" Malik's voice cut through the air, still carrying that edge of confusion. Jamal offered a small smile, but his mind was racing. He wanted to believe it was over, but something told him that it wasn't. Officer Johnson's reaction, the way his hands had twitched at his belt, there was more going on here. "Not yet, Malik," Jamal replied, "but we're not leaving until we make sure it stays over." Patrice's hand rested gently on his. "We should get out of here, Jamal. I don't feel comfortable anymore." Jamal glanced at the officers one last time. Officer Johnson was still staring at him, his face a mix of resentment and confusion, as if trying to process what had just happened. He could tell that Officer Roberts was struggling with the same emotions. This wasn't the reaction they had anticipated when they walked into the restaurant. They had expected submission, silence, or perhaps a fight, but not this. This defiance, this quiet power. The tension in the restaurant had dissipated, but the unease in Jamal's gut was still there. This wasn't the first time he had faced racism. He had seen it in subtle ways, in veiled comments, and suspicious stares, but this was different. They had been blatant, and the presence of that Army Commandant had only further exposed the ugliness in their behavior. Patrice, sensing Jamal's unease, took a deep breath. "Jamal, don't let them get to you. We're better than this." He nodded, squeezing her hand in return. "I know. I've seen too many good men and women put through the ringer for things they didn't deserve. I can't let this slide." Just as the family was about to stand up and leave, the sound of a door slamming open stopped them. The same Army Commandant who had intervened earlier reappeared, his eyes locked on the officers. "Officer Johnson," he called out, his voice firm, "I'd like a word with you." The restaurant fell silent again. The officers flinched at the mention of their names, but neither moved to acknowledge the commandant. It was clear they didn't want to make eye contact, but there was no way out now. Jamal exchanged a glance with Patrice. This wasn't over. The Army Commandant wasn't just walking away. The situation was about to escalate. As the commandant approached Officer Johnson, the air became thick with tension again. Jamal could feel his pulse quicken, the calmness that had started to settle around his family slipping away. This was far from finished. Whatever was about to happen next would either bury this situation or fan the flames even higher. The Army Commandant stopped directly in front of the two officers, towering over them. His eyes were cold, but his posture was deliberate, as though he was measuring every word he was about to say. "Do you know who I am?" he asked Officer Johnson, his voice low but clear. The officer's eyes darted nervously. "Yes, sir," he stammered. "I'm the one who makes sure people like you stay in line. I'm the one who deals with the fallout when your kind forgets who they're supposed to be protecting." The commandant's words were like a punch to the gut. Officer Roberts shifted uncomfortably. "We're just doing our jobs, sir. We had a report of suspicious behavior." The commandant raised a hand, cutting him off. "I don't care about your excuses. Your job is to protect people, not harass them based on their skin color. I've seen this before." Too many times. His voice dropped even further, every word heavy with conviction. You two are a disgrace to your badge. The officers looked visibly uncomfortable now, shifting their weight from foot to foot. The truth was undeniable, and they couldn't hide from it anymore. They had crossed a line, and everyone in the room could feel it. Jamal watched the scene unfold in front of him, his chest tightening. He had been in tense standoffs before, in combat zones where lives were on the line. But this was a different kind of battle, one that had no clear-cut end. His family's dignity, his own sense of justice, was now at stake. The commandant wasn't done. He turned to the rest of the restaurant, his gaze sweeping across the room, as if letting every patron witness the moment. This isn't just about this family, he said, his voice rising so everyone could hear. It's about every person who's ever been mistreated, who's ever been disrespected, who's ever had to face injustice, simply because of the way they look. The restaurant was completely still now. The staff had paused their duties, and the patrons were watching the standoff unfold. It was almost as if they had all collectively held their breath. I suggest you both apologize, the commandant said, his tone still calm but laced with an underlying threat. And do it quickly, before I make sure this goes further than just a conversation. Officer Johnson stood frozen, his face red, caught between his arrogance and the reality of the situation. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Now the commandant demanded. The silence in the room stretched longer, thick with discomfort. The eyes of the restaurant's patrons were fixed on the unfolding scene. The only sounds were the occasional clinking of silverware, and the hushed whispers of people who weren't sure whether to speak up or remain quiet. Jamal stood tall, his heart pounding but his resolve stronger than ever. Officer Johnson, still rooted to the spot, looked like he was trying to gather his thoughts, but every time his eyes flicked toward the Army Commandant, his confidence seemed to falter. He cleared his throat, his face turning even more crimson. "I'm sorry," he muttered, barely audible. His words hung in the air, lacking any real weight. It was an apology born out of pressure, not sincerity. His tone dripped with reluctance, and it was clear that he was only saying it to defuse the situation, not out of any genuine remorse. The commandant didn't move, his eyes piercing Officer Johnson with an intensity that made the officer shrink back. "That's it." The commandant's voice was low, but it carried through the restaurant like a sudden clap of thunder. "An apology with no meaning? You think that's enough? You think words can fix what you've done here?" Officer Roberts, who had been standing silently, shifted uncomfortably. He could feel the tension in the air. He knew what was coming next, and he hated that he was part of it. "Sir, we didn't mean to cause trouble. We were just doing our jobs," he stammered, his voice weak. The commandant turned to him, his eyes cold. "Doing your job?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "Your job isn't to intimidate people, it's not to make them feel less than human. Your job is to protect them." Jamal's fists clenched. He had heard that line a million times before, cops claiming they were just doing their job. It never felt like an excuse to him. It felt like an easy way out. They used that line to shield themselves from the harm they caused, as if the title of officer could erase the damage they inflicted on innocent people. Enough of the excuses. Jamal finally spoke, his voice firm and commanding. "You don't get to hide behind doing your job when you know damn well what you're doing. You targeted my family because of the color of our skin, and you thought we wouldn't fight back. You made us feel small, like we didn't belong here." Officer Johnson flinched at Jamal's words, but the commandant was still focused on him, his gaze unrelenting. "I said apologize," the commandant repeated. "And me?" Officer Johnson took a shaky breath, his hands still clenched at his sides. His apology had been a reflex, something to end the uncomfortable silence. But he knew it hadn't worked. He wasn't fooling anyone. The words meant nothing. Slowly, with obvious reluctance, Officer Johnson turned toward Jamal and Patrice, his gaze darting between them. I'm sorry," he muttered again, this time louder, though still lacking sincerity. We overstepped. We shouldn't have come at you like that." Patrice, who had been silently observing the entire exchange, finally spoke up. Her voice was calm but filled with an undeniable strength. "It's not just an apology we need," she said, her gaze meeting the officer's. "It's change. You can apologize all you want, but until you change how you think, how you treat people like us, it means nothing." The commandant nodded in approval. "Exactly. It's easy to say words, but actions speak louder." And you, Officer Johnson, have shown us exactly what you stand for. Jamal's heart swelled with pride at Patrice's words. It was the truth. An apology was just the beginning. The system needed to change, and until it did, this would keep happening. They would keep being the targets, the ones treated with disdain, while the officers walked away unscathed. The commandant stepped back, giving them space. He turned to face the rest of the restaurant. His voice, once again calm but filled with authority, boomed throughout the room. I think this is a good time for all of us to remember that the color of our skin doesn't determine our worth. We all deserve respect, dignity, and fairness. We all deserve to be treated as equals. These officers may have forgotten that, but I won't. His gaze flicked briefly to Officer Roberts. You have a choice, he said. You can stand with your colleagues and let this continue, or you can stand with what's right. Officer Roberts remained silent, his gaze lowered to the floor. He couldn't meet the commandant's eyes. He knew what was right, but he wasn't sure he had the courage to act on it. Jamal felt his anger subside slightly. The moment was powerful, but he wasn't naive. Apologies, no matter how well delivered, didn't erase years of mistreatment, and the officers' attitudes wouldn't change overnight. But this moment, this confrontation, it was something. It was a start. The commandant didn't wait for a response. He simply nodded once, turned on his heel and walked out of the restaurant. His exit was as commanding as his entrance, leaving behind a room full of silent onlookers who had witnessed a rare moment of justice. Jamal exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the encounter slowly lift off his shoulders. His family was safe for now. They could leave this restaurant with their dignity intact, but that didn't mean the fight was over. Patrice stood, giving him a gentle smile. We're leaving now, she said. I think we've had enough excitement for today. Jamal nodded, but his eyes stayed on the officers, who were still standing in stunned silence. The apology had been given, but Jamal knew it would take more than words to fix the system that allowed incidents like this to happen. He turned to Malik and Amara. Let's go, he said quietly. We'll get out of here before they try anything else. As they left the restaurant, the sunlight outside felt different. It felt like the world had just shifted a little, though Jamal knew there was still much work to do. The battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but today they had made their stand. The Carter family walked out of the restaurant, the cool afternoon breeze hitting their faces as they stepped onto the sidewalk. Jamal felt a strange mix of relief and anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. The confrontation had been intense, and though they were walking away victorious, he knew this wasn't the end. Jamal glanced at Patrice, then at Malik and Amara. He could see the weight of what had just happened reflected in their faces. This wasn't just about an altercation in a restaurant. It was about the kind of world they were living in, where his family was treated as less than human simply because of the color of their skin. We're okay now, Patrice said, her voice soft but firm. She gave Jamal a reassuring smile. We made it out. Jamal nodded, his eyes scanning the street as if waiting for something else to happen. He couldn't shake the feeling that their battle wasn't over, that what they had just experienced was a symptom of a much larger issue. As they walked toward their car, Jamal's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was an email from his military command. He opened it quickly, skimming through the words. It was a letter of recognition, a commendation for his service and leadership. But it meant nothing in this moment. The military honor, the respect he had earned throughout his career, it seemed hollow now. It hadn't shielded him or his family from the hate they'd faced today. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and turned to Malik, who had been unusually quiet. Hey, are you okay? Jamal asked, his voice soft. Malik nodded, but there was an unease in his eyes that Jamal couldn't ignore. It's just, I didn't think people like that still existed. Like I read about stuff like this in history class, but it feels different when it happens to you, you know, Malik said, his voice filled with a mix of confusion and frustration. Jamal placed a hand on his son's shoulder, pulling him into a side hug. I know, son, I know, it's hard to believe, but it's real. We're living in a world where people like those cops think they can get away with treating us like this. But that's why we have to keep fighting, and that's why we stand up every time. Not just for us, but for everyone who doesn't have a voice. As they reached the car, Jamal felt a strange sense of responsibility settle over him. He couldn't just go back to life as usual. He couldn't let this moment slip by as if it were some isolated incident. He had a duty, not just as a father or a veteran, but as a man who had seen the world at its worst. He knew that now was the time to take a stand. No more waiting, no more silence. When they were all inside the car, Jamal started the engine, but his mind was already racing ahead. The news would soon be filled with reports of what happened. And the question would inevitably be asked, what's next? What do they do when the police don't just bend the rules but outright break them? What happens when the system that's supposed to protect people becomes the very thing that victimizes them? Jamal didn't have all the answers. But what he did know was that this couldn't be swept under the rug. He was going to make sure of it. He would take this fight to every platform he could, every opportunity that presented itself. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away unnoticed. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from the Army Commandant, whose name Jamal had never got. He opened the message quickly, his fingers moving over the keys with urgency. Jamal, the truth is this. Today was just one small piece of the puzzle. The police officers you confronted. They've done this before and they will keep doing it unless we make them face the consequence. I have connections, and I will use them. But I need your help to make sure this story doesn't fade. We need to make some noise. Jamal felt a surge of determination run through him. The commandant was right. This wasn't just about him or his family. This was about changing a system that had allowed this to happen far too many times. This was about showing the world that they couldn't just harass people, harangue them, and think there would be no reckoning. Dad? Malik's voice interrupted his. Jamal turned to him, his eyes steely with resolve. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen again, for us, for everyone. Patrice, who had been quiet for a while, gave him a knowing look. She didn't need to say a word. Jamal knew that she too was ready for the fight. Together they had raised their children to be strong, to be resilient, but most importantly to stand up for what's right. As they drove home, Jamal's thoughts continued to race, but he felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. They had faced down injustice, and now they were going to expose it for the world to see. They were going to make sure the officers who tried to diminish their dignity would answer for what they had done. And in that moment, Jamal knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.